Welcome to Violin and Viola Day. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. My name is Jess. Today we're diving into challenges and tips that I have from my years of working with violin and viola players as an Alexander Technique teacher. So, first we need to talk about some basic terminology stuff for those of you who might be Alexander Technique teachers who are not violinists. The shoulder rest is the thing that goes underneath the instrument, if they use one. We'll get into that in a second. Then you have the body of the instrument itself, right? The wood going out to the neck of the instrument, tuning pegs on the end. And then the chin rest, if they're using one. Most violins do have one, but they vary quite a bit. That's going to be the thing that sits on top of the instrument. It's kind of like a wood cup, and that's what they actually lean on. So, I never tell my students that they should or shouldn't use a shoulder rest or chin rest or anything like that. This varies so much depending on each individual person and their proportions and what teachers they've been working with. Some teachers are really against shoulder rests and they think that absolutely no one should use them and everyone else is doing it wrong. And then there are others that say you absolutely should use a shoulder rest because otherwise it cranes your neck at an awkward angle and makes it harder to hold the instrument. So you're going to find some very varied opinions on that one. So the way that I handle it, the first, usually around 6 weeks, working with a violin or viola player, is working with their basic fundamental movements, same as with all the other students that I have. How do you stand? How do you bend? How do you sit? And we do that all away from the instrument first on purpose so that you can do things like learn on stand here, shoulder anatomy, arm anatomy, how does that all fit together? And how can you start to learn to be able to lift your arms without necessarily having to lift the whole collarbone to shoulder girdle area. So it's basically, how do you lift your arms without shrugging? For some people, that takes a lot of practice. Now, some of you who are violin and viola players might be saying, but I have to do that in order to hold my instrument or it will fall down. Depends on the person. So let's dive into this. It really varies a lot depending on the proportions of each person and really how they were taught to play. If someone came from a more self-taught or more like bluegrass or fiddle focused environment, they might be most comfortable with not using any shoulder rest at all. And so the wood body of the instrument sits directly on the collarbone. Some of those people might use something kind of grippy underneath. We'll look at a couple options for those. But what I find in general is that a completely unlifted violin or viola really only works if someone has a relatively short neck. I do not. So the times that I have held a violin and worked with it to get an idea of, what is it that my students actually need to be able to do, I definitely needed something underneath in order for me to not have to really crunch in or really lift the shoulder a lot to be able to make contact and hold that in place as you shift positions up and down the neck of the instrument. You will find, especially really high level bluegrass fiddle players who are wildly good. It's insane. They're so fast. They're really not crunching down in, and they might not even have contact with the jaw to the instrument at all. And I've asked a whole bunch of different people about this. How is it that really high-level bluegrass and fiddle players can do that? And depending on who you ask, the answer is either they're just not shifting position as frequently as a lot of classical rep needs to be able to do. So this is a violin today. If the instrument here, I'm going to hold it with my other hand so that I don't have to crunch my neck down to hold this thing. There's 4 strings on a violin, and depending on where your hand is, it changes the balance of the instrument. And along the way, you need to not drop the instrument when you let go of the support of your thumb underneath in order to slide the hand to higher positions. So there are some folks who, on the classical side of things, will look at the bluegrass players who don't make contact with the jaw onto the body of the instrument and say, well, it's mainly they can go super fast, but they're not requiring to go up into, these crazy high up to, C6 positions here where they need to be able to be way up here around the whole neck of the instrument. So they're staying mainly down here, and there's not as much shifting that needs to happen that would require them to clamp down on the body of the instrument. Others who I've talked to about this, other classical players, have looked at that and said, I don't know how they do it. I've never gotten to work with a really high-level fiddle player. I would love to. I have so many questions, so maybe someday. So that's the body of the instrument. Then we have a bow. Again, you're going to find a lot of different answers on how exactly to hold a violin or viola bow. In general, the only times that I will comment on a student's bow hold is if I see the thumb going so far that it's underneath their ring finger. The only way that most people's hands can do this is by really pulling a lot in the thumb, and it's that extra pull, that tension, that I question and will ask them. I'm never going to tell them, right off the bat, hey, you're doing this wrong. I'll still, ask first. Tell me about your thought process for how you're holding your bow and where you're trying to put your thumb, because if you're trying to cross the thumb all the way underneath to the ring finger, depending on the length of your fingers, that might be a very long way. And so there can be a lot of thumb tension in the hand to do that. The other time I'll comment on it is if I see a student's fingertips really pressing hard and like the fingertips themselves turning white from pressure, then I'll ask about that. I don't see that very often though. Typically violin and viola teachers are like really on top of that one so that people don't hurt their hands while they're working with the instrument. So being able to do this has its own challenges, because you have to be able to manipulate the wrist and the angle of the fingers all the way up to the shoulder, and to be able to do things like get all the way up to the base of the bow here, quite close to where the hand is, and chug around on here on certain types of rep. You need to be able to do that, and not go nuts with this shoulder. So those are some other challenges that I see come up. In general, the priority system that we're working with here with violin and viola, and really all instruments, but here we're especially looking at the shoulders, as neutral as possible. Find your neutral first, which again is why I make my students stick with just basic body mechanics, fundamentals stuff at first, and then add your instrument to that. And notice I had to turn my head here. My string players need to learn about spiraling. We use this idea of a spiral to talk about the way that the spine can rotate around its own axis. So you can think of this as just turning your head, but a spiral in the spine can come from really far down. And if we really want to, a spiral can go all the way down to the feet. So as I'm turning here, there's a certain amount that I can turn with just my eyeballs, and then my neck needs to rotate in order for my head to turn. And then if I'm going to keep going, at some point, the rest of me will need to follow suit to be able to continue turning. Violin and viola are one of many instruments that are played to the left. So what I recommend for almost all of my students, unless there is some reason that they really want to stay with their feet parallel, is when they're playing standing, play in a bit of a lunge with the left foot forward. So spiraled like that. So my left foot is forward, my right foot is a little back, and practice this bounce. Notice that as I'm doing this, my pelvis is not going forward compared to my shoulders. I'm going to turn sideways so you can see that better. So here's my little mini lunge. It's not very far. My heel of the front foot, the left foot, is only about the same level as far as forward, backward as the toes of my right foot. Those are lined up. It doesn't even have to be that much. This is about in my toes of my right foot in the middle of my left foot, and this is still plenty enough for a lot of people. So as I'm doing this tilt and bounce and lean movement, my hip joints are about here. Notice that I'm never letting my hip joints get in front of my shoulders. This is something that I work on with violin and viola players a lot, because it can be very tempting to do this. A lot of my violinists do this. What this is it's crunching the thoracic spine up here, my upper middle back, crunching that down, back and down. What that does is it puts pressure on the spine. Understand? So taking this level of the spine and crunching it back and down, and it puts pressure on the back. That's a great way to end up with back pain. So keeping this system as neutral as you can and moving the places where our skeletons have great movement capability. Hip joints, knees, and ankles. Movement comes from the legs when we're dealing with these instruments. More legs, less spine is what I tell a lot of my students. So all of these movements, including being able to look down, if you're standing and playing and your music needs to be low, or if you need to look around for whatever reason, being able to look to the side and visually communicate with a piano player, right? Very important. They're going to be down compared to you if you're standing and they're sitting. That all needs to be able to happen without doing things that are unhelpful in the spine and the shoulders. So finding your neutral first, and then just a gentle spiral. And then the instrument fits right here. On me, I would want a shoulder rest that's high enough that I really don't need to add additional tilt. Ideally, I would like my violinists, if possible, to match their own proportions. This is not always possible, and so then that's when we can adjust and talk about lengthening along that curve. And if you're going to do a kind of grab with the side of the jaw here, up and over the chin rest, make sure that when you do that, you're still doing it with length and not with compression. You see how that's a little bit different? That really crunches me in. So if I need to kind of grab the edge of the instrument here in order to hold the very expensive thing in place, doing that with lengthening along that curve of the neck rather than with compression. If you do need to raise the left shoulder in order to hold the instrument, do it on purpose, do it intentionally, and think of it as up and out and not up and in. That's the one we're really trying to avoid. Thinking about the shoulder movement as coming up and in will really make people compress on themselves, and it's, again, a great recipe to hurt by the end of, a 3-hour rehearsal. Yeah, you're going to be in pain doing that. So if you need to lift this whole system, think of it as up and out. An analogy that I like to use is 80s shoulder pads, right? These very like V-shaped up and out kind of things, and that's what can hold this instrument level if you need it. Let's look at some of the fun gear that can be used. I love these. I recommend these to a lot of people. These are kitchen cabinet liners. They have a little bit of give to them. They're a kind of like foam in there, and they're kind of grippy. It's not sticky. There's no residue on this at all. It's just something that has a little bit of grip to it, and this can work great. So there are some people who will just cut off a small piece of this stuff. It's very cheap. You can go to Home Depot or buy this on Amazon. It's a couple dollars for a whole roll of it. And we like cheap. So this can either wrap around the whole instrument and give you grip on both sides, below and above. You can also fold this a few times and get a nice little pad there. And so that can be rubber banded to your instrument pretty well in the same way that a lot of folks do with a sponge. Sponges are also fine. I just don't have one in here. So that would sit right there, and then the instrument sits on top of that. It's nice and grippy, especially compared to fabric. Another nice grippy bit is just felt. This is just craft felt from a basic craft store. You can cut this up into whatever shape you want and secure it however makes sense to your shoulder rest. And it just, again, it's just nice and grippy against fabric. This can be especially relevant for men who need to be able to wear tuxes or like suit jackets while playing. A lot of that fabric is pretty slick and it can really kind of slip around on you. I find that it's not quite as necessary for players who are frequently women who might be doing their big performances wearing like a gown, and the gowns are usually not super covered in the shoulders. They're often like a spaghetti strap or a strapless or something like that. And then the skin tends to have a little bit more grip than slidey fabric. So felt works great. So overall, violin and viola players need to keep an eye out for a couple things. Using legs more than bending in the spine, and even if you need to do something like tilt backwards, I was working with a violinist on this just because of the technique that she was using in order to get the balance that she needed against the shoulder. She did kind of need to tilt back just a little bit to work with how this was balancing on her rounded shoulder. If you need to do that, again, with lengthening, it is okay to have to leave perfectly neutral, perfectly upright. Do it intentionally, do it with practice, do it with a mirror or video, especially from the side, so you can really see what you look like as you're doing that. And remember that you can always base your technique around the closest thing to neutral you can get. So let's make sure that our technique for these instruments is healthy. Long, healthy, sustainable careers, that's the goal. More legs, less spine. Using a lunge can be great. And as the instrument comes up, a spiral up and over, and really coming back consistently to up and lengthening, and that soft nestled connection between the head and the neck, between the ears, behind the nose, letting that rotate to be able to connect with the instrument. I have a previous video that was on different types of chairs for string players, so definitely go check that out because that's pretty universal across different instrument types, and I didn't want to have to dig into chairs for every video in this series. So please go check that out as well if you're interested. Next up will be cellos.